Facts. Yeah, facts. We tell you facts. All the facts.
But
Yes.
but as Kate said, this is our last Monsters From series, and as it is an unexpected addition in a lot of ways, it was really wonderful. The horrors of this film were much more about the horrors of puberty and familial trauma than it was about a monster itself. In fact, actually, for my section, I was like, I wonder if there's lore about red pandas. There's not really.
Mhm.
And in fact, red pandas aren't monstrous at all in Chinese mythology, nor do they have much of a mythological backstory in the
Yeah,
first
'cause they were
place.
just real animals.
Yeah, and that was done on purpose, actually. So, according to an article on Marie Claire, Symbolism in Turning Red Explained by Quincy Lagarde. The writer director Dalmichi told Insider that Pixar chose the red panda in part because red pandas don't have a deep mythological background. I think we wanted the space and the room to come up with a whole legend and mythology, she told the outlet. The red panda being a relatively clean slate means that the themes of the film can stand on their own without other popular myths being added or conflated with the
Mm.
story, which I thought was really interesting.
They get to control it.
Yeah, it's not like they have to, like, pull from something else. It's this unique thing that they get to totally make their own. And they also said that they wanted the red panda to clearly represent, like, this magical puberty experience as well as, like, a transformation, and that the red panda presented an opportunity with color as well to represent the period itself, as well as, like, the more intense emotions of, like, anger, lust, embarrassment, and the relation to the actual red pandas stemmed mostly from the fact that one, they were like really cute, but also like a character trait of red pandas is that they're very dedicated and protective over their young. So that kind
Huh,
of correlates
I
too.
didn't know that.
Yeah. I didn't either until I read it in the Marie Claire article. And I mean, who knows? Maybe that's not real. I've never seen a red panda in real life, but according to the internet, that's what it said. So,
Got it.
um, but yeah, so a lot of ways, my section instead will be oriented around like what I think the director was hoping people would take away from it, and less about like the monster itself, but more about like what the story was trying to tell us,
Mhm.
and about like that familial trauma can be generational, and that protection can become toxic if done without clear communication and trust, and as well as like dealing with intense emotional stress is alleviated when you have strong, loving relationships surrounding you.
Mhm.
So I won't talk about the horrors of puberty in this episode because we did that last week, and in a lot of ways in previous iterations of the Monsters from series. So if you're interested, go ahead and check this out.
Mhm.
Um, but today I'm going to be talking about trauma.
Woo!
Yay! It's actually one of my special interests. So like this information mostly just lives in my brain, and I also just pulled stuff from the internet so that you know I'm not full of crap. Um, so, for those of you who know very little about trauma and its impact on the brain, I'll provide some introductory knowledge. Trauma is unique to the individual, and an event that may be traumatic to one person could just be like another day for someone else. It all kind of
Mhm.
relates to our sensitivities to various situations, and ultimately connects to all other facets of our life. For example, a parent may interpret a house fire as being horribly traumatic to themselves and then like put that on their child to think like they are experiencing the traumatic event in the same exact way, where the child could potentially be more traumatized by the loss of their dog that ran away from the fire instead of the fire itself.
Hmm.
So like everyone's kind of impacted by different events uniquely to who they are as a person. um, Most trauma honestly is purely subjective as an experience, in that it's highly dependent upon the impact on the individual. In the same way, trauma can manifest in behaviors vastly differently depending on the person, because every person has a different method of coping, as
Mhm.
well as different protective factors. That I'll kind of explain that a little bit more later, but like different things impact you different depending on like what security systems you have built up in your own body,
Mhm.
as well as externally.
Yeah, like how
So
prepared you are.
and also like who's in your life. So like a child who has a caring and attentive person or like a support system in their life may handle a traumatic event better than a child who feels unseen and isolated. And better is also subjective to the outsider viewing that child's experience as well as the person's experience. Like someone who is handling their trauma by repressing themselves and forcing themselves into a dissociated, more convenient state of people pleasing and like becoming a shell of their true identity, but sits still in class, may be
Mhm.
perceived by others as handling it better. Um, or more conveniently than the child who like handles their emotions more outwardly uh, through aggressive or destructive behavior. But better is really more that the child or person feels safe enough to explore their emotions without threat or fear of abandonment. So, as we
Mm.
saw in the film, it was like sad that when she had to lie to her mom to say like when I get upset, I think about the people who love me, and she was thinking of her friends. She had strong friendships that were like really powerful and meaningful to her, that like acted as a support system, and she didn't have this fear that she would be abandoned for being herself and who she actually was.
Mhm.
And that's like very important when you're dealing with traumatic events. If you feel safe, your ability to get through those events, even if you're not handling it, like you still may have really strong emotional reactions, etc. You have a stronger support system to support you through that event. You're going to come out the other side stronger a lot of the time.
Mhm.
Versus if like you don't really have any support systems, you're more likely to exhibit more destructive coping mechanisms, both to yourself and those around you, but mostly to yourself.
Yeah.
Um, So men said with understanding from their peers and caretakers in their life, they have more protective factors, is kind of what they're called. These are things that kind of prevent the trauma from impacting the brain in a damaging way.
Mhm.
The same thought process extends to adults, and in many ways, we may feel that's familiar to some of us when thinking internally, looking at ourselves of like how we react to situations, but also like looking at a lot of parents,
Mhm.
specifically from the Gen X and above generations, who spent a lot of their time like not processing their emotions because they had to push them down. There were the I won't think the societal pressures were necessarily different, but the conformity push maybe was.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's really about like, do you feel safe to be yourself, who you are authentically with the people who you love and who are supposed to love you? And that kind of impacts how trauma affects your brain and whether or not like it is as damaging versus not as damaging. But as I said, like the impact of said experience often also differs for each person. And in many ways, existence itself is traumatic, and especially when living in a capitalistic, oppressive society. The results being that most adults are balls of unhealed trauma, covered in knots of repressed traumatic events and experiences that they've either never coped with or are still actively working through. This is showcased beautifully in our film with May's mom and grandmother unintentionally, just through like keeping their own feelings in, creating this like cycle of traumatic experiences that May is tasked with untangling.
Mhm.
And whether this is done intentionally or unintentionally, the impact is something that young people today are dealing with, and is being reflected a lot in children's media. We're seeing this explored, like these family dynamics, and finding new ways to cope with things, and also just like children helping their parents see the world in a different way.
Mhm.
That's being reflected in a lot of children's media, specifically like Disney Pixar, but like I'm sure there are others, and that we saw in films like Encanto, Turning Red, Luca, and others. um, the research on trauma is ever evolving. So a lot of this stuff I'm saying, but it's very possible that the research on it could change because it's something that is more recently being explored in depth on its impact on like health outcomes,
Mhm.
as well as like the true impact of like what it does to our brains. So the research is ever evolving. And when I originally was introduced to trauma research, the bulk of this exploration was done through understanding the early childhood development and the impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So for anyone who heard that, is like, what is that? The CDC describes ACEs as potentially traumatic events that occur in a child in childhood. ACEs can include violence, mental abuse, growing up in a family with mental health or substance abuse problems. Toxic stress from ACEs can change the brain's development and affect how the body responds to stress. So, ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance misuse in adults. However, ACEs can be prevented and like healed from. So, something that is interesting about this is you can actually score yourself using the ACE framework to figure out like what health outcomes may happen if you've experienced a certain amount of adverse childhood experiences.
Hmm.
But I strongly advise against doing that unless you're in a very positive, healthy mindset at the time. As the score itself can be very triggering when taken in without any tangible next steps to the or solutions to
Hmm.
the information
Just
that you're
knowing
getting.
and being like,
Yeah,
wow,
because
this
it's
sucks.
like you could get all these really horrible health problems, and you're just like, not only was I traumatized greatly, but now I'm also gonna die. Like, like it just activates something in you that's very stressful. So I
Yeah.
don't recommend looking at it until you like recognize all the ways in which you are actively healing from that stuff. Because one thing that's really important to know is that when you're looking at this stuff, that there's the brain is like plastic, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So what's important to know when you're exploring your own trauma is that neuroplasticity of your brain makes it possible to heal from your trauma. And while that is something that takes active work, it is possible. And also, if you're interested in just learning more about this, I highly recommend checking out one of the more popular spoken explanations of this that Nadine Burke Harris speaks on in their TED Talk. It's a video generally shown in like intro trauma classes. Um, and was something that I was shown in my intro trauma class. But it really just they do a great job instilling this like state of urgency within the listener, as well as just like explaining things in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, like TED
Um,
Talks too.
yeah, exactly. So neuroplasticity is a fancy word to explain that the brain creates neural pathways, both from traumatic events as well as through positive and constructive therapeutic healing experiences. So, with that understanding, the ACEs can feel slightly less like a death sentence because you have next steps. You have like instead of it being like, "Oh god, this is awful," instead it can be like, "Okay, now I recognize that this is actually really important and that I
Mhm.
probably should actively work to fix these things so that I don't have all these like stress related health problems." And yeah, it just gives you more of a reason to fight for yourself in your healing journey. It makes you feel way more validated being like, "Hey, maybe I don't talk to that person anymore because they hurt me
Yeah.
mentally." And then you feel like you have
Does
an
more harm than
authority
good.
to
Yeah.
justify that because of the things that adverse childhood experiences can cause medically within yourself. You have more of like a foothold to stand on. So for anyone who's like still in their survival stage of existence, you likely won't start to recognize the impact of your experiences or like how they may have traumatized you until you reach a more stable or safe space. The fun thing about the brain is when it's in survival mode, you are literally just going day to day. So you can't even view things from the outside. Like you can't
Mhm.
even look at the forest. You are in the trees.
Yeah.
You are plowing through the trees. The forest doesn't exist. You're just trying to get out of the forest.
Yeah.
Where when you're out of it, you start to see the trees more. You start to like reflect and like have more of an understanding of what's happened to you. And that's ironically, unfortunately, one of the times where the more upsetting symptoms of trauma rear their head.
Mm.
That's when is when things are like calmer and when you've left the active danger that you were under. So once out of danger, your body may have trouble adjusting and regulating your emotional responses to stress. This can manifest in self-sabotage, not trusting your instincts or intentions of others, as well as your own intentions, having big emotional reactions to things that used to feel like not a big deal, or seeking out experiences that feel familiar but are dangerous. So, like for example, to speak to my own experience, I used to do that all the time. Uh,
Mm.
I used to think that like I was the cause of every bad thing that ever happened, and that's like how I had a very long self acceptance journey, I
Mhm.
guess. So when I was younger, I handled this by like dissociating and like desperate. people pleasing and like shrinking myself. But as I got older, like I started to handle it in really toxic ways where I guess like arguably the first way was toxic, but it was like either through like really reckless decision making or like irrational emotional reactions to situations that didn't call for them. Like the one time where like someone died and I was like, everything's fine. And then I got a flat tire and I was like, sell my car.
Yeah.
We don't need the car anymore. The tire's ruined. So the whole car needs to go because I don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, things that like seem small before like escalate because you're out of the danger, but your body still feels like you're in danger still.
It's
Um,
like when you have a bad day and you take the piece of paper, like the paper towel, and it rips
mhm.
wrong, and you're just like, "Oh, now I'm broken."
Yeah,
But
like the
everything
world
else
is
you
ending.
understood, yeah.
This is a slippery slope into my mental decline.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, so like I would not handle things. There was lots of like through my healing journey, like things I realized that I did that weren't good
Mhm.
before I started that. So like I would also seek out like partners or friendships that subconsciously reminded me of those traumas and that they either exhibited erratic, toxic behaviors, struggled with alcoholism or drug addiction, or were like otherwise just neglectful and cruel to me because I wasn't able to save the people that I loved from their inner demons. So I often sought out partners or friendships that had similar problems with the hopes that like I could finally be enough for someone to be get better for.
Mm.
And that's not how it works. That's not real. And not healthy ultimately. It's definitely damaging and re-traumatizing experience for like everyone involved, including me and that person. So another big part of the healing journey also involves like viewing your reactions to your own traumatic experiences, and viewing your actions and how they may have traumatized others, either through intentional or unintentional harm. So an unfortunate reality of being a traumatized person is that, as we saw in the film, like you're likely to hurt people in your healing journey or
Mhm.
before you realize you need to start a healing journey. Like there are things that you did when you were hurt that hurt other people. Um, so like while the intention behind your actions may have been like, I didn't mean to, but like it didn't really matter at the end of the day because you hurt somebody and your behavior hurt someone else. So what's important when unpacking all of this for yourself is recognizing all you can really do is take accountability for those actions, and do better in the future. Apologizing is a piece of it, but apologizing with the goal of external forgiveness, like from the other person, can be re-traumatizing for the person you've hurt in the first place, which will like make the situation worse. So an apology should only be given with the understanding that that person you're apologizing to may not forgive you for what you've done, and ultimately, like they have that's their right, and you kind of just got to be like, okay, I did a bad thing. You
Hmm.
right.
Fair,
I have
fair.
to respect that. So yeah, like external forgiveness is not something you can control. So you can only forgive yourself and like accept the consequences of that person not wanting to be in your life anymore. So you're not entitled to another person's peace as much as they're not entitled to yours. And like yeah, all you can do is hope that like that changes, but understand and accept that if that never does, that just has to be fine. It's also important not to project your trauma onto others. Something that like happens a lot when you're like unpacking your own trauma and you like feel like you got to a really great place of regulating yourself. Um, you see other people's experiences and you're like, that was like my experience. Maybe my advice and helping them recognize that that's what happened is helpful. It's not. Like approaching someone else with the intention to have them recognize their trauma can be more traumatizing than just letting them cope with their experiences authentically.
Hmm.
If someone is okay with how an experience took place, calling attention to how they should be reacting instead of how they are reacting, is you projecting your trauma onto somebody else. Like forcing someone else to recognize the trauma is ultimately a selfish and centering thing to do, because you're making your experience about validating your own experience instead of what is actually in their best interest. You're like, your experience is your experience, but now it's mine.
Hmm.
So we're both going to talk about the fact that happened to me too, and now you're going to be upset too. When like if they were fine, just let them be fine, kind of deal.
Yeah.
Um, and as someone who like feels like an alien all the time and doesn't understand people sometimes, I repeat this information to myself all the time. So like I say this to you because this is my internal dialogue. I'm like, I did a bad thing. I need to just process this. I can only accept that like I've done a thing, and they apologizing won't really help because ultimately that's a selfish thing to do unless they want me to say sorry, which is
Hmm.
like you do it once, then you move on. I don't know. But I say this all to you because this is my internal dialogue for myself. And it also is backed by like scientific trauma research. So like you get a little bit of both. Um, and ultimately, like either way, it like kind of ties back to just like navigating the world and figuring out what the world is and how to exist in it because it's like kind of a bad time for most humans. So you kind of just gotta like do the best you can to exist in the least bad way possible. Bad being subjective as well. Um, And yeah, as I said previously, it's important to have just like tangible next steps when exploring your own trauma. And like, if you are the first generation of a person actually dealing with and unpacking these traumatic things that have happened to you as like a generational thing,
Hmm.
be kind to yourself and patient with yourself that like sometimes people are still plugged in and they might not get it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of part of it too. And yeah, and you just gotta like recognize like your piece is important just as much as anyone else's, and there's lots of healing to be done. And I think it's yeah, it's big traumatic event that a lot of people realize too as they're getting older is like their parents are also just people
Yeah. It's a
that
big traumatic
once
event.
yeah, we're just like, wow, okay, they're just like a person who's very flawed.
Just a regular people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
made of
Well,
chaos and sadness, and like we
and
just
they have
kind
their own stuff. They got
yeah,
their own stuff they're working through, and we got to give them a little
yeah,
credit for that too.
yeah.
But also, like, take care of yourself, because if they're not
Mhm.
putting in work and they're only being harmful, it's okay to leave. It's okay to not.
Yeah, it's like a little bit of everything. Like, obviously, you got to do what's best for you, but you also got to acknowledge when you do a bad thing. So, like, it's like really multi
Hmm.
tiered. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you can only forgive yourself for it and try to do better, and the world will make their decisions.
Yeah. Well, it's like what in the airplane when it's like you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you help someone else. So it's just like
Yeah,
deal with your own stuff. You can't just be like helping everybody, right? Like, and it's because trauma is experienced differently for everyone. There's no one way to deal with it either. So you have to let people just figure that out themselves.
yeah,
Like I was just talking to a friend of mine who was just like, it seems like people use the word trauma really loosely these days. And so they're saying like anything is trauma, like anyone has PTSD, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, it's not that it's like all of a sudden everyone is traumatized all the time. It's just like now we're talking about it.
yeah.
So like now we're allowed to attribute
There's like
those things to people.
recognition. Yeah,
Where before you weren't allowed to talk to that. But then I also had this whole conversation where I did explain like it's interpreted differently for people. There are times where, like, I have a friend who gets very anxious and like the world is ending a lot for things that I consider to be minimal because I've gone through other things where I'm just like you have that experience and you kind of build up this uh kind of protection for yourself because I've already been through those things. So that seems little to me, but that's big for
for
them
them. Yeah,
because that's like the biggest thing to them that they've experienced. And it doesn't
yeah,
make it any like it doesn't minimize their experience. Um, because I have a different interpretation of it. So I think it's just like really important for people to understand that. And I think the cyclical thing is super important too. Because sometimes you just think like, well, I got through it so you should just also do it. Like we can't
yeah,
put that same expectation on other people and expect them to get through things in the same way and to
yeah,
cope with their traumas in the same way or their past in that way and just like accept people are all different. And that's something I struggle
yeah.
with all the time. Like I'm totally the kind of person that's just like, get over it. I got over it. And then I'm
You
like,
should
I
too.
didn't. I
Yeah.
didn't get over it. Spoilers.
Well, it's like a
Um,
big thing, honestly. Like that's like a generational thing, but also I think just like a human thing where it's like where you sacrificed a certain amount of things for your own sanity or to just exist and not be murdered.
mhm.
That you're like when you see someone not have to do that, you're happy for them, but also you're like, what about my inner child that has been
Yeah.
dying
You're like
this
bitter.
entire time? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there's definitely like, I understand why some people feel that way, but also I recognize the inverse where it's like, but also that's their whole world. They don't
Yeah.
know.
And this
And
is a
also,
big
yeah,
deal for them. Yeah.
yeah,
And I guess it's just being patient and understanding with others. And I agree that this film is really about familial trauma. And it was like, passed down. Like you see Ming have a similar experience of wanting to be the golden child and to be what her mother wanted. She says that she used to be really close with her and something broke there because she couldn't be that anymore.
yeah,
And it's like internalized like trauma, and then like her mom's internalized trauma, and then it's like external trauma as well. Like it's all this like confounding. It's just like a mess. So that by the
yeah,
time it gets to Maylin, she's just like, why? And it
yeah.
really does take. I agree that it's our generation that are like, it's time to go to therapy and it's okay. Um,
Yeah, and there's something so beautiful about that too, that like it's happening even if it's late. You know what I mean? For the older generation, that's like they are some reaching healing just from the push of the younger generation being like, "Hey, it's okay to have feelings and like if you've been gay this whole time, come out, you know? Like not
mhm,
every like not everyone
yeah,
has to just be a shell person. We can be real people who
yeah,
don't think society should do this to people anymore. You know what I mean? Like
mhm,
if you've just been miserable your whole life, like you don't have to do that. It's like the whole Plato's cave thing.
mhm. It
You
doesn't
you
like
you
just
can
because it's
leave the
always been that
cave.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have to always be that way.
Mhm.
Um, it's the whole
Yeah.
time. And I
Yeah.
mean, also one thing I recognize where it's like lots of people will try to like heal others as an attempt to heal their inner child. So also like you got to heal yourself too. That's like a really big thing because like even if you don't mean to, you're gonna hurt people and it's
Mhm.
gonna happen. And it's
Yeah.
something that from personal experience, it's like there are lots of things I probably should have done differently in my life because I was very broken for a long time and I should not have been trying to help anybody else do it. Should have been in therapy and doing my own stuff. And now I recognize that and it's very positive and I'm doing
Yeah.
that work and
And
it's
then
good.
we wish, therapy was more affordable, things like that.
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah.
figure it out. But I think just even
That's just
acknowledging that you need to work on things.
yeah.
So, but this was a really great film and it was a really fun series. Like I really enjoyed it. I love that we got to unpack Monstrous Femmes even further and in this very specific way and got to see the different um just symbolism and experiences that women go through or femmes go through um, in their journeys of self-discovery and empowerment that take all different forms and how they're affected by society, how they're fighting back against society's expectations, all those things. It's been really really fun,
Yeah.
and I'm definitely excited for the next thing to do. If you have any thoughts, comments about things that we've covered, things that like in the future, if we do another Monstrous Femme series and you would love to see that, let us know. Um, and you can do that by emailing us at theghouls@gmail.com or commenting on our social media or leaving us a comment and a rate in a whatever on Apple Podcasts.
Yeah.
So make sure you're subscribed. We have some really cool things coming up, and our 200th episode is coming up. It's so close.
It'll be a million
Um,
years, million episodes.
yeah, and so um, don't get married.
Delete your
Delete your
kids
kids.
or your kids will heal you of all your sadness
Yeah, or
by
like
making
your
you
kids
talk
will.
about it.
Yeah, your kids will show you that it's okay to
Yeah,
heal.
to just be a person, whatever
Yeah.
that means.
Like a lot of times it's like older generations just didn't even know that was an option. And so
Yes,
it just takes someone being like, "Hey, did you know you could just do this?" And they're like,
that's why representation matters. That's
"Yes.
why that
Yes.
man needs to shh
It's
because it
not for
doesn't
you,
always have to be
bud."
made
And
for
that's
him.
okay. That's
So like people can
okay.
realize they're not aliens sooner.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Yeah. That you belong here.
yeah.
And your red panda is awesome. All right. Bye.
Bye.